immediately opens lines, a direct challenge for central space, setting an aggressive tone. Mirroring the pawn opens central lines, contesting the same vital squares and initiating a symmetrical battle for dominance. Instantly contesting the center, this knight advance prepares for castling and pressures black's pawn. Developing the knight to its natural square, this response immediately contests the center and prepares for further piece activity. Introducing immediate tension on the c6 knight, this move preps for central pawn advances and begins controlling open lines. Challenging the bishop's dominance up front, forcing white to decide its long-term role in the center. Clears a pathway for the queen and bishop while weakening black's pawn structure. Doubling the c-pawns creates a structural weakness on the queen side that can be exploited later. Securing the king allows white to consolidate his pawn structure and prepare for future central expansion or piece activity without immediate fear of attack. Shifting the pawn to f6 significantly compromises your king's safety, opening a potential diagonal for the opponent's bishop and weakening the dark squares around your monarch. Unlocking the center's potential, white immediately contests the pawn structure after black's risky doubling, aiming to exploit the weakened queenside. Releasing the central tension simplifies the position, but now black's queenside pawn structure is irrevocably doubled. Recapturing towards the center immediately opens lines and aims to leverage the doubled pawn's positional weakness. Instantly challenging white's central knight initiates a pawn race, potentially opening the c-file for active piece play. This repositioning prepares to challenge black's advanced pawn chain and potentially open lines toward the black king. Bolstering central influence and preparing for swift piece activation across the board. Rebuilding the knight's mobility to pressure the d-pawn and coordinate with the queen opens avenues for attack. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal prepares potential pawn breaks and supports the center. Shaping a dynamic pawn structure now, white aims to develop attacking pressure by leveraging the open central files. This knight repositions, aiming to support a central pawn push and potentially challenge white's bishop on f4. Unveiling the queen signals an immediate intention to pressure black's center and eye the king's flank. Exchanging the bishop clears the king's diagonal and opens lines, but it concedes the bishop pair, potentially weakening your pawn structure in the long run. Reclaiming the pawn, white aims to disrupt black's central control and free up the knight for more active participation. Simplifying the position dramatically, black proactively resolves piece tension, though it trades off the bishop's pair advantage. Centralizing the knight after the exchange offers better piece mobility and prepares for a potential kingside initiative. Actively developing, this piece seeks to control crucial central squares and potentially disrupt white's knight coordination. Reinforcing the central pawn chain while preparing to contest open files gives white a more harmonious piece placement. Developing the queenside pawn structure with b6 aims to secure the bishop's diagonal and prepare for queenside expansion, though it does weaken the c6 pawn slightly. Reclaiming central space and preparing a knight outpost on e6 creates dynamic attacking possibilities. Repositioning the bishop to f7 seeks to shield the king and potentially reroute the piece to a more active diagonal later. Reinforcing the d-file's pressure, the rook repositions to support potential pawn pushes and prepare for an endgame advantage. Developing the knight to its most active square now aims to challenge white's centralized pieces. Reinforcing the central d-file, this move prepares to contest essential open lines and improve piece mobility. Securing the open c-file is a sensible aim, preparing for future pressure and piece mobility. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure creates a more robust defensive shield against potential pawn storms. Securing the king behind a pawn wall offers immediate safety, prioritizing king security over further pawn advances for now. Unlocking the c1 bishop's potential and reinforcing the king's safety are the immediate goals as white repositions for active defense. Bringing the rook to the open e-file fortifies the central pawn structure and prepares for potential kingside pressure. Initiating pressure on the d5 outpost demands black's immediate attention, potentially disrupting their central pawn structure. Repositioning the monarch to a more sheltered square, the king prepares to aid its forces on the king side, anticipating future breakthroughs. Launching an attack on the king side, this pawn advance aims to gain space and potentially create weaknesses. Reclaiming the open d-file now solidifies central control, preparing to contest it actively. Relocating the knight to e3 aims to reinforce the kingside attack and prepare a kingside pawn storm. Sacrificing the exchange to untangle your pieces and prepare for potential endgame activity. Reclaiming the open file, white neutralizes black's pressure and simplifies into a more manageable, albeit still intricate, endgame scenario. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, seeking influence on the d5 outpasture while preparing for central pawn advances. Initiating an attack on the queenside pawn structure, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses in black's setup. A cautious attempt to solidify the kingside, though it potentially surrenders valuable space on the kingside. Shifting the king to a more active square begins a delicate maneuvering phase in the endgame. Pivoting the pawn forward aims to gain queenside space and potentially unlock the c-pawn. Unlocking the king's pawn majority, this aggressive advance opens lines and aims to disrupt black's central control. Opening that kingside file creates immediate counterplay and challenges white's slightly exposed monarch. Opening the h-file creates immediate pressure, potentially targeting the king and disrupting black's defensive setup. Doubling pawns on the kingside creates a lasting structural weakness. The king ventures out, but exposing it so early in a reduced position carries significant risk. Black's knight will soon be much more active. Reconnecting the knight to the queenside pawn structure offers some relief from the isolated pawn. Capturing the pawn exposes your king significantly and unlocks black's central pawns. The knight boldly reclaims central outpost, disrupting white's pawn structure and aiming for further infiltration. Preparing to challenge that central pawn majority by activating the rook. This retreat repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to contest the open e-file and pressure white's central pawns. Shifting the king forward now seeks to activate its defensive capabilities and potentially support pawn advances on the queen side. A proactive repositioning, the rook aims to establish a better diagonal influence and contest the important open file. Repositioning the knight to attack c5 and potentially swing to f4 or e5 offers flexibility. This bishop's repositioning aims to create new attacking chances on the kingside while challenging white's centralized knight. Centralizing the knight on d5 intensifies pressure and prepares to exploit the open files now that black's pieces are somewhat cramped. Fighting for central pawn control while solidifying the queenside, but it risks isolating the d4 knight. A bold pawn push that opens lines, but sacrifices structural integrity for potential central activity. Opening a queenside avenue with this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and gain space. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, c3* aims to prevent further queenside expansion and potentially create a passed pawn on the c-file later. Opens the b-file for queenside pressure, but creates a potential weakness on c3. Opening the b-file creates immediate attacking potential and forces black to confront white's advanced pawn structure. Reclaiming the central square with the knight opens possibilities for future pawn breakthroughs and improved piece mobility. Cracking open the center with c4 aims to disrupt black's rook and knight coordination. The knight dances into the central vacuum, eyeing white's pawns and aiming to disrupt their pawn chain. Gaining central space with this rook repositioning helps consolidate the pawn structure. Gaining a foothold for the bishop on the queenside promises to disrupt white's central pawn structure and activate black's dormant pieces. Seizing the open central files with the knight creates immediate threats along the 6th rank. Recapturing the knight clarifies the central pawn structure and transitions towards an endgame where pawn races will likely dominate. activating the king and seizing the initiative on the queen side, forcing a pawn exchange. Repositioning the bishop to b7 threatens to untangle the queenside pawn structure and challenge white's imposing knight. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside promises to disrupt black's defensive setup. Challenging white's initiative, black repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses. Solidifying the pawn chain, this advance aims to restrict black's piece mobility and gain queenside space. Embracing the central pawn majority, this king bravely ventures to support its advanced foot soldiers. The rook pivots to the 8th rank, aiming to exploit the open file and pressure black's vulnerable queenside pawns. A desperado tactic to disrupt the attack, though the doubled pawns remain a significant structural weakness. The king's exposure is now a glaring weakness, inviting immediate tactical threats. The monarch seeks refuge, aiming to escape the pawn storm's advance and the looming threat of white's active pieces. Asserting control over the central squares with pawns, preparing for a potential breakthrough. Unlocking the rook on the newly opened c-file presents a dynamic opportunity for black. Relocating the rook offers improved defense for the f3 pawn and better board coverage.